Next speaker is Erika Nesvold, who will be talking about environmental justice consideration in lunar development. She is an astrophysicist who has worked at NASA Goddard and Carnegie Institution of Science. She's an astrophysics engineer for Universe Sandbox, which sounds like an interesting physics-based space simulator. And a bunch of other things. Please correct me and add things if you think I skipped something important there.
No, that's great, Nicholas. Thank you.
Thank you.
Nicholas.
I think, yeah, there we go. Get that mute. Yes, thank you for your invitation, Nicholas, and thank you for Alistair for needing to be cut off so we can keep things rolling. I'll see if we can try to make up a little bit more time, and I hope Alistair can enjoy one of Panera's giant chocolate chip cookies and take a breath after that rush.
You'll have your 30 minutes if you want to.
I'll
push things up.
Okay, I appreciate that. We'll see how it goes. I also am a person who likes to keep on schedule if we can, so we'll give this a shot. I'm going to take a slightly different perspective on lunar development in this talk. I want to again thank Nicholas for his invitation to speak at this conference, because I always like to chime in on these especially very technical, heavy conferences. Today I'm going to talk about some of the environmental justice considerations that we'll need to make as we develop our plans for our future on the moon. Just a quick side note, I realize the moon's environment isn't green, but I picked this color scheme because sometimes it's just nice to have a different color scheme after all of these black and blue space talks. Quick background on me, as Nicholas said, I'm a computational astrophysicist, which is still my day job, but several years ago I started getting interested in the ethics of space science, exploration, and in particular space settlement. So I've since written a book and co-founded a nonprofit on these topics. The book is called Off Earth and the nonprofit is called the JustSpace Alliance, which is there on that slide. In general, my work in this area asks people, especially people who are working on specific plans for space, to ask them to consider the ethical and human rights challenges that we'll face, as well as the technical and economic challenges that we'll face as we continue to move outwards into space, and to also look back at our history of facing similar challenges on Earth so that we can learn from our past and our present, so we don't, at the very least, we don't repeat the same mistakes. Let's try some new mistakes this time. So given that this is the LDC, we can think about what are these ethical and human rights challenges specifically that will arise during lunar development. So many of the talks over the past couple of days have considered things along these lines. I know a lot of you have talked about human safety and risk management, especially when it comes to things like radiation shielding. You're focused on the technical aspect, which is of course very important, but we need to think about things like, are the people who are going to work on the moon, do they have enough information about the risks that they'll face from, for example, from radiation to give informed consent for that kind of exposure, things like that. Lunar developers also need to consider things like accessibility when they design their habitats. What kinds of people with what kinds of physical abilities will be able to access these places and use the equipment that you're designing, and which will essentially get left out of the process because of the designs that we make. Thinking about humans living and working on the moon also suggests that we'll have to think about things like the labor rights of the people that we send there. Nowadays, it's funny to think about labor rights in space because the people who go and live and work in space are astronauts, and they still have this really elite status in our culture. They're compensated very well. More people want to do it than can actually do the job, so it's a very high competition workplace. But eventually, the dream, of course, for these permanent, sustainable settlements out in space is that it'll just be a much larger population of just regular workers who happen to work on the moon, but they'll be in a dangerous, isolated environment, which is the kind of workplace that tends to leave workers vulnerable to exploitation. So we want to make sure we're thinking about protecting their labor rights as well. And of course, the people who live and work on the moon are going to have to address some or all of these questions themselves and figure out how to live together with each other. Other humans might be the most dangerous things in space, as they often are on Earth. And so this is going to raise questions of how local governance is going to work. And of course, all of these plans, all of the talks this weekend, also involve interactions between humans, or at least our robotic surrogates, and the lunar environment. So today in this talk, I'm just going to ask you to consider the implications of that interaction in the frame of environmental justice. So I have found that it can be hard to get people to think about space environments like the moon as an environment that maybe we need to think about how to protect it or conserve it, especially in the same way that we think about Earth's environments, because I mean, look at it. It's a magnificent desolation, as Buzz Aldrin said. It doesn't have rainforests or coral reefs or adorable panda bears that elicit our emotional attachment. But I argue that there are several reasons that we need to be considering the effects of our interactions with this lifeless, desolate environment. For one thing, it was there before we got here, billions of years before humans came along, and I think that if nothing else, gives us a reason to at least say, okay, what are we actually doing here before we make major changes to the environment? As we're very aware from this weekend, it's full of valuable resources that we can use, which is the sort of thing that inevitably leads to things like conflicts over resources, lots of questions about the legal landscape, which I know many of you are aware of, and also things like the kind of environmental justice and how we use those resources as a species. As an astronomer myself, I'm also aware that it's very scientifically rich. And this is true of most of the space environments I talk about. And I find it interesting because astronomers and planetary scientists historically were sort of the last scientific field who has to grapple with this conflict where suddenly there's other non-scientists working on the same in the same environment as the things we want to study, and we have to figure out how to compete. That's not something astronomers have had to deal with for the history of our field, and now suddenly it's becoming more of an issue. And most importantly, in this list of reasons we should consider the moon as an environment is that we are capable of damaging it. We're already seeing that we're capable of causing damage to the space environment in low Earth orbit, and it's not hard to extrapolate, especially as we talk about activities that will significantly change the lunar environment, like mining and extracting any resources, really, that it's going to, whether you consider it harm or not, it's going to permanently change this landscape. And in particular, that's because unlike most environments on Earth, the very lack of an ecosystem, the lack of water, the lack of atmosphere means that any significant changes we make to this physical landscape aren't going to be reversed or not going to have the edges smoothed off over time the way we see here on Earth. There's going to be no overgrowth of plants. The wind and water aren't going to take things back to its natural state. Anything we do to the moon is going to stay there permanently unless we go there and change it again. So notice that I didn't title this talk Environmental Protection of the Moon. I'm not talking about environmental protection or conservation. I'm specifically using the term environmental justice, which might be a new term for some of you. Environmental justice movements look at things like how are the costs and benefits of the use of an environment distributed? They're about who gets a say in how an environment is used, things like that. And so in my view, environmental justice is more focused on the needs and rights of people, of humans, rather than the importance of protecting the environment itself. And to me, this is a bigger priority for things, an environment like the moon that we know doesn't harbor an ecosystem that we need to protect, although I might, if I have time, briefly touch again on that idea later in this talk. So environmental justice is a huge topic. I'm just here to provide just a brief survey of critical questions about environmental justice for the lunar environment so that if any of you are interested in any of these individual topics, you can follow up with me or go off and do your own reading. One thing I find both fascinating and challenging about thinking about environmental issues in the space environment is that, as I said before, it's only fairly recently that we have such a diversity of groups wanting to use this environment for so many different and potentially conflicting purposes. So, of course, scientists have been interested in these environments since before we could even physically go and get there, and they're just now realizing they have to start competing with other people who also are able and interested in going there physically. Of course, there's also the idea of exploration, which I think in time is going to merge into tourism. Once people are able to actually go out to the moon, they're going to want to go out to the moon just for the sake of doing it because certain types of humans, as you know, just love to go out and explore new places, and that's related to science often. But this idea of private space tourism is, of course, emerging as well. And of course, in the longer term, that could eventually evolve into permanent settlement, which is, I know, a goal of many of you. Of course, also, especially when we talk about resource extraction, there's just the idea of profit. I mean, a lot of people who are talking about resource extraction want to do it in the service of some of these other ideas of building human settlements, of doing science. But to be honest, a lot of people, especially in some of the private companies, are also just interested in making money. You know, it's been said that the first trillionaire is going to be made in space. That's been said mostly about asteroid mining, but I think a lot of you who are very aware of the on-the-ground resources that you're looking at have done the math and worked out that there's a lot of money to be made here, which also just sets up different conflicts with organizations like groups of scientists. And of course, as has always been the case with the moon since the beginning of human space exploration, national interests are still present in the groups, the group of motivations for why people want to continue lunar development. Now, one issue is that most of these groups, honestly, are used to having their way. As I said, the scientists are used to having their way in space because they just haven't had competition before. National interests and or private companies are the ones who are providing the funding for these activities, so they think they should get to direct things. And so that this just sets up a lot of conflict. And also notice that 3 out of these 4 pictures are from the Apollo era. So we've had many of these diverse interests competing, or at least operating at the same time on the moon for the history of human space exploration on the moon. But it's going to be getting more complicated with more opportunities for conflict as we start to have more and more activities on the moon and start to use these lunar resources. And many of these conflicts are going to happen in specific places in lunar environments. So I know from listening to your talks, especially the mining folks, you're very aware of this, but I have to point out to people who have only really heard the PR from space companies that while space may be infinite, the resources that we can actually reach and access are finite, and they tend to be concentrated in certain areas, like this fairly famous now imaging of surface water ice on the moon from NASA's Moon Mineralogy Mapper. It tends to be sitting in the bottom of these shadowed craters, and that appears to be true with a lot of the resources that all of you have talked about this weekend, whether it's actual extractable resources like water ice. I suspect helium-3 is also not evenly distributed throughout the moon's surface, although I might be wrong on that. Special places on the moon, whether it's these permanently shadowed craters, peaks of eternal light for power generation, or these lava tubes where we want to potentially build habitats. They are that specific location of the concentration of these resources is going to focus conflict on specific places. So how do we resolve these conflicts? Now that is a big question that's generally addressed by space law, and I'm not a space lawyer, so I'm going to stay away from that for the purposes of this talk. But my argument is that at the societal level, at the species level, we should also be thinking about our priorities for how to best use these limited resources. Now, obviously, no one at this conference is in charge of our whole species, but the general rhetoric you hear of people who want to do lunar development, space settlement, and I've heard it at this conference, is that we often like to speak on behalf of the species. We're talking about humanity's future. And if we're going to use that kind of rhetoric, then we also need to think responsibly about what our priorities should be for our species. One concern in particular that's being expressed in the context of low Earth orbit, but will also apply to lunar resources, is the worry that a gold rush in space, as I've heard it referred to earlier in this conference, inevitably leaves people behind. It's a bit of a zero-sum game when you have finite resources, which conflicts with another common type of rhetoric that you hear a lot among people who want to see humans living in space, which is the idea that space should be for everyone. And this isn't just PR rhetoric for space groups. It's in Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty, which is right here, which says that the exploration of use of outer space shall be carried out for the benefit and in the interest of all countries, irrespective of their degree of economic or scientific development. So this leads to questions like, okay, if we're having a gold rush in space, if lunar resources, other finite things like slots in low Earth orbit, if we're doing this in a first come, first serve basis, what happens to the countries and the organizations that aren't yet spacefaring? What will be left for them by the time they develop a space program and get up there? Is there not going to be anything left? And does that violate this idea that space should benefit all countries, irrespective of their degree of essentially ability to be spacefaring? And this leads into one framework that's also often used for environmental justice, which, especially when people are talking about environmental justice here on Earth, which is called distributive justice. So the idea of distributive justice is to say, are the costs and benefits of the use of an environment, in this case, the lunar environment, are they being equitably distributed? And notice it says equitably, not equally. It doesn't mean you have to hand out the exact same amount of resources to every human being, but it's looking at a just and fair way to do things. So, and in particular, it's making sure that the people bearing all the costs aren't the ones getting the least benefits and vice versa. So an example that's often used from Earth is climate change. So the island nation of Vanuatu, which is here, it's been named the most vulnerable nation to climate change by the UN. And like a lot of small island nations, it's sea level rise that is really threatening the physical existence of this country. Their government's been really proactive. They have committed to 100% renewable energy by 2030. But of course, if they're the only ones who make that commitment, it's not going to save them. And the unjust part of this is that while they're paying the highest costs for humanity's use of fossil fuels, it's the larger, less vulnerable nations in the rest of the world that have been profiting the most from fossil fuel use. So you'll notice Vanuatu is in Oceania, and that is the tiniest little wedge on this graph showing annual CO2 emissions by world region. So the largest chunks here, China, the US, Europe, etc., are not the ones who are bearing the largest costs from this use of this part of the environment. So this is environmental injustice, and it's what movements for distributive justice are working against. So we can look at the space environment and space environmental justice through this same lens. So we can ask, what are the costs, impacts, risks of our use of the lunar environment, and who is bearing the burden of these costs? So of course you can think of the financial costs. Since we're working within this capitalist framework right now for space, the people who are putting in the investment, the companies, et cetera, are also hoping to get the most benefit out, and they're hoping to balance it that way. And that's financial. So financially, we can set that aside and say that's supposed to be the trade-off there. But there are other costs, of course. There is the safety risk. So the astronauts, the workers at launch sites, for example, are literally risking their lives, and we want to make sure that they are also benefiting, whether that's making sure that they're compensated, making sure they understand the risks, making sure we're doing everything we can to protect them, etc. But that's something that will be important as we send more workers into space. There's also, at the moment, a significant cost of space flight to the local environments on Earth around the launch sites. So this is a piece of debris from that infamous Starship test launch in May of last year in Boca Chica, Texas, at the Starbase facility. The one that blew up on the launch pad and blew up the launch pad, scattered a lot of debris. And this was very controversial because a lot of the area around the Starbase launch site is protected environmental wetlands, public beaches that the locals depend on. And so you could argue, and the locals certainly have, that the surrounding environment is bearing the brunt, the costs of this testing without really getting much of the benefits. They're not directly getting the tax benefits, for example. There's also the use of the land itself has been controversial. This is the Alcantara Space Launch Center in Brazil, which, being close to the equator, is very popular, and the US uses it as well. But when it was built in the 1980s, about 300 local families who had been living there for generations, they were the descendants of escaped enslaved Africans, had been living there on the beach for several generations. They were forcibly displaced and moved out of there by the Brazilian government so that they could build that launch center there. And this is often an issue with launch centers, telescopes, things like that. We need to build them in very specific places to benefit from, for example, being close to the equator, and we want to be far away from cities, for example, and that often means that it's the poorer indigenous people who are being displaced. The government of Brazil has since apologized to those families, but this is the kind of thing that we need to keep an eye on. It's easy to get lost in the beauty of the rocket launches, and especially if our thoughts are on the moon rather than on Earth. But the Earth's environment and the people who live there are part of this calculus as well. And then, of course, on the other side of the scales, we can ask, what are the benefits of humanity's use of the lunar environment, and how are these benefits going to be distributed? Again, I mentioned the profit. There's also these finite lunar resources, any lunar infrastructure we build, any scientific knowledge. We build more scientific observatories, for example, on the moon, like the proposed Lunar Crater Radio Telescope. How are they going to be distributed? If it's just the people who put the financial investment in making a profit, okay, that's the way our current economic system works. Is that gonna just worsen income inequality? Or is anyone actually, is that calculus actually fair? Are there people, for example, if we use up all these lunar resources before non-spacefaring companies and nations can get up there, is that a fair calculus as well? So all of these kinds of questions are larger than any one organization or group of engineers can answer. I'm not asking you to solve these problems, but they, especially since they touch on these big questions of how we think economic and political systems should work. But since many of you are doing the work that will eventually lead to the practical use of this environment, it's just something for you to be aware of. We'll also need to consider questions of intergenerational justice. What are we leaving behind for future generations? Industry in particular likes to talk about sustainable development, which is more about protecting the industry itself to make sure that its development can continue into the future. But again, we need to think on species level terms here. Lunar resources are not infinite, so how can we make sure that we're leaving enough behind for future generations? We're all, of course, very aware of our capacity for resource overuse on Earth. Industries like lumber or mining are still grappling with finding the right balance here on Earth. And we should ask, how are we going to prevent resource overuse on the moon? So this is not a real picture. Obviously, this is a screenshot from the excellent sci-fi movie Moon, which came out in 2009, which I recommend, which is about a miner on the moon. And they had this great little graphic of strip mining on the moon. As I've learned at this conference, surface level strip mining is perhaps not going to be what we're aiming for initially, but it is a good visual representation because of our awareness of strip mining on Earth, of the fact that even though lunar resources can seem immense to us, humans are great at exponential growth when it comes to developing environments. And in fact, there's a paper by Martin Elvis and Tony Milligan from 2019 that argues that we should not exploit more than 1/8 of any given environment in the solar system. And 1/8 seems really small, but their argument is if we're considering exponential growth, stopping at 1/8 leaves us essentially 3 doubling times to figure out how to come up with a sustainable, maybe even circular system, which I think the next talk is going to discuss a little bit. But of course, with intergenerational justice, essentially that asks us to leave our descendants with as many options, as many choices in their lives as possible, which raises some interesting questions about how we should use the resources that we do extract from the moon. What kind of infrastructure could we build that would benefit future generations? If we're taking those resources away from them, can we at least put some of them into an infrastructure that's going to benefit them? So things like lunar gateway or some kind of telecom system, scientific installations, launched landing pads, maybe some kind of emergency evacuation equipment is something that we can responsibly leave behind for our descendants. And maybe things like legal infrastructure as well. As I mentioned, the space lawyers are all working on that. We can also ask, should we, if we care about the pristine part of the moon, whether that's for scientific reasons or just because people like looking at a pristine wilderness, should we designate some parts of the lunar wilderness areas to leave them untouched for future tourists, scientists, which has been proposed, particularly on Mars, but obviously that would work for the moon as well. Although, then we can ask, is this even possible on the moon, given the effects that are coming out of a lot of modeling, that launch and landing is going to kick up so much dust in this low gravity, zero atmosphere environment that, is any part of the moon surface actually going to remain pristine if we're doing a certain number of launches and landings?
8 minutes.
Yep, and because I only have 8 minutes, I will skip this side note I was going to take into environmental ethics. I said that the lack of an ecosystem means we don't need to think about the rights of the ecosystem itself, the rights of the environment itself. That doesn't mean that there aren't people thinking about the rights of this lifeless lunar environment. I think it's a fascinating discussion, but within the scope of this shortened talk. So I'm going to focus on environmental justice as it relates to people, as I promised at the beginning. So if I've convinced you at all of the value of incorporating any of these considerations into your work, you might be wondering, okay, well, what am I supposed to do about that? How can lunar developers incorporate these considerations into your plans, besides listening to talks like this one, of course? I absolutely recommend consulting with the experts, and I don't mean myself, I mean the people I consult with, social scientists, environmental ethicists, philosophers who think about these ideas on Earth, and a number of them who have written about these issues for space. policy experts, legal scholars who can talk about how environmental protection can be worked into a legal structure that also supports and encourages industry and development. Environmental management experts, again, who work on the same kinds of ideas. And also, I would argue, environmental activists here on Earth who have really clear visions of how they think we can live sustainably with environments here on Earth and also have a happy and thriving society. We can also identify useful parallels from here on Earth. Already people are doing this for the technical questions. I heard Antarctica referred to in Gary Barnhart's talk earlier today. It's an excellent parallel, both in terms of technology, anthropology, and in terms of legal protection. So Antarctica hasn't started a war despite how many competing claims there are. There's a lot of scientific exploration, and currently it's being protected from mineral extraction. International waters and fishing is another area that's often used as a parallel for space law. As I mentioned before, things like the lumber and mining industries and what they've learned about what's worked and what hasn't historically here on Earth in terms of resource conservation. And another big parallel I like to point to is climate change, because it's one of these areas where the actions of a single large company or nation can affect this environment, the atmosphere in our case, that at one point in history it was thought that it was too big for humans to affect. Now we know that we can affect it and damage it, and it's an environment that we all feel we have some right to, and so it's a good parallel for space in that way. I also encourage you to give research and policy time, or at least space, to develop. This follows along with what environmental ethicists would call the precautionary principle, that it's better to think about what we're doing before we rush in, because the mistakes we made can be irreversible in an environment like this. I know that all of us, especially at this conference, would love to see more human activity in space in our lifetime, and I'm not telling you, stop working on space or pause your work indefinitely. I know there are people who argue for that. I'm pro human space settlement. I'm just arguing that we should incorporate these policy conversations into our work rather than trying to outrace them. Just make sure we're taking deliberate action so that we can avoid repeating the harms of the past in a brand new environment. So I will just leave up my conclusions right here, which can be summed up as saying, let's learn from the past, do better in our future in the lunar environment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Erika. That's very good. There's time for some short question, and I think I'll start with James Sloan. He has several questions and comments. I'll take two of them because they seem to be connected. Should space only benefit countries and not individuals, in which individuals escape a despotic government? And if the general public doesn't think they're being cheated of opportunity, are they, and who decides?
Who decides is a great question that is important when we're talking about ethics, but also is a big part of what space law looks at. The reason I mostly talked about nations here instead of individuals or groups is because I was talking about the Outer Space Treaty, which talks about the rights of signatory nations. I think when you're thinking about environmental ethics, you need to think about humanity as a whole and figure out what are the marginalized groups of people that are being left behind. Sometimes that'll be nations, sometimes that will not fit into those buckets of nations. As for individuals being able to escape their despotic governments in space, I realize it's a common sci-fi trope. I'm not convinced that's any time in our near future for several practical reasons. But I know it's a common theme amongst a certain type of proponent for space settlement. But in general, yeah, I think it's important to think about all of these different categories. Individuals, communities, whether that's small local communities who happen to live near space launch centers and don't care about the space industry at all, or whether that's a certain type of person who wants to go do a certain type of work on the moon. I think we need to consider all of those.
Yeah, let's see, we have Marufa. How do you envision the government structure if various countries develops their settlement on the moon?
Well, right now the Outer Space Treaty says that you have to follow the laws of your launching nation. when you're on the moon. So that'll be the near-term solution. The moon is interesting because it's still so close to Earth that you can continue to get direction and consultation with the Earth, and you can expect visitors from the Earth if anything goes wrong. Talking about local governance farther away, like Mars and farther, I think is more interesting. No matter what, though, no matter how short the latency is to talk to Earth, people who are living in a community on the moon are going to be living in a community on the moon. They're going to have to figure out how to figure out at least small local conflicts amongst themselves. And I think that's going to be really interesting. I think a lot of them will bring their ideas of how humans should solve problems with them. That could lead to conflict between neighboring communities. It could also just lead to conflict within those communities. I think humans bring all of their vices with them as we go out into space. It's not going to remain a blank slate forever, and I don't think we're guaranteed a utopia. I think we have to keep working on these problems, the same problems that we struggle with here on Earth.
Sounds reasonable. A very short question from, if I can get him unmuted.
Yeah,
Michael Allen, if we can hear what he's saying. Yep. You were unmuted briefly, but very poor sound. A quick question.
yeah, good day. Quick question. Alan here, Marshall. Thank you so much. I'm not trying to copy a question from before. Long distance. The concern that I brought out, I really want to bring on. This is from the last bit and this one. What about the effects of the construction work on the moon? The psychological effects of the let us say the overpopulation, and then what regulation, what regulator framework would there be put in place to regulate, for example, cases of overpopulation on the moon? Because I'm also taking effect that some voices, like third world countries, are going to be overlooked in terms of their voices, and those, for example, who would rely on the moon like for a good night's sleep, someone who would rely on the moon for a peace of mind, right? Let us say that, how will these construction work affect the landscape of the moon, the glowing effect of the moon? And let us say, we know that mass also is a big thing, because the mass of the moon.
Okay, thank you, Alan. Thank you, Michael. A short question.
So
Yes.
There was a few different questions.
So the regulatory framework to control all of that.
Yes, thank you. There was a few different questions. In the interest of time, I'll just answer one of those questions that I heard, which is the idea of what about the people back on Earth who consider the moon important to their culture, their day-to-day lives? They wouldn't want to see it visibly changed due to development. I think practically it's going to be some time before we make any changes to the moon, despite the little sci-fi movie screenshot I showed. It'll be some time before any changes that we make to the moon are going to be visible from Earth. But I think it is a relevant question because the moon in particular and the night sky in general is fascinating because it's something that all humans feel a personal connection to, and the idea that someone could come along and change it without consulting you is upsetting to individuals and even worse than that for certain cultures. And in fact, we've already seen some issues with things like human remains being sent to the moon, which is seen as an honor in some cultures, and in other cultures, human remains are considered to be something that desecrates a place, and so you're desecrating a sacred place like the moon, and that has led to conflicts and controversy already. And so, yeah, in a longer term, that is also something we'll need to consider.
Thank you, Erika.
And who will comprise this board? Who is in charge of regulation?
You'll have to ask. That's a question for space lawyers. Sorry.
Oh, thank you.